Hey everyone, tonight's journey doesn't begin with a war or a royal feast, but with something far more intimate and much smellier, the world of medieval hygiene. We're heading back to an era where people feared baths more than disease, where garlic served as deodorant, and where it was perfectly normal for your neighbour to hurl bizarre things out the window. So before you settle in, consider liking the video and subscribing, but only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of content. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always amazing to see the global crew gathering here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a soft calming hum, and let's drift into tonight's story. Cleanliness is next to godliness. No one in the 14th century said that. Here's a surprising truth. In the early Middle Ages, bathing was actually encouraged. Monasteries had bathhouses, and some Roman bathing traditions still lingered in parts of Europe, but by the later medieval period the view shifted. Bathing went from being seen as beneficial to being dangerous. So what changed? In a word, fear, superstition, and a deeply flawed understanding of how the body worked. People believed hot water opened the pores, and that illness could enter through them. Imagine living during a plague, stepping into a bath and thinking, "I've just made myself a magnet for disease." That was the mindset. Bathing too often, they thought, weakened the body and invited sickness. Water, in their eyes, wasn't a cleanser, it was a threat. To make things worse, bathhouses began gaining a sketchy reputation. By the 1200s and 1300s, many of these once respectable spaces became more like social clubs with questionable activities. Some even functioned like brothels. Religious authorities took notice. Bathing became linked to immorality, and in medieval Europe, that was a fast track to getting shut down. So many people simply stopped bathing. Not because they enjoyed being filthy, but because staying dry was seen as safer, more virtuous, and definitely more modest. Being nude was one thing. Being nude in hot water felt like inviting evil itself to join you. Now, that doesn't mean everyone went around coated in grime. They still cleaned themselves with cloths and herbal rinses to wiping hands, faces and feet. But full-body baths? Rare. They were mostly for the rich, the reckless, or the incredibly itchy. So yes, people feared bathing, but it wasn't out of laziness or stupidity. It was their version of staying healthy, with the limited science they had. Sadly, without knowledge of germs, no plumbing and no understanding of bacteria, this strategy was built more on fear than a fact. Long ago, in a town not yet drenched in horse dung and despair, the bathhouse was actually a hub of wellness, warmth, and just a little awkwardness. Thanks to leftover Roman influence, early medieval bathhouses had heated tubs, steam rooms, and surprisingly kept a hopeful atmosphere. They were like primitive spas where folks could soak and socialise. No scented candles, but still a bit of relaxation. Monks, merchants, and even lower nobles used them. For a short window in time, hygiene was in style. Then things took a turn. By the 13th century, bathhouses gained a new reputation. Bathing became less about getting clean, and more about getting close. Some bathhouses offered more than just water, with attendants who were a little too welcoming and tubs that had seen too many strangers. The line between health and hedonism blurred quickly. It didn't take long for religious leaders to intervene. Public nudity, even with soap, wasn't acceptable, and sexual misconduct? Even worse. Bathhouses became associated with vice, disease, and shame. And when the Black Death arrived, people were more than ready to close the doors for good. After all, you can't catch the plague from a tub that's been nailed shut and labelled sinful. But it wasn't just disease or immorality that doomed the bathhouse. It was suspicion itself. Over time, the very act of bathing came to seem indulgent, risky. Soaking your body in warm water with strangers felt like asking for both physical illness and spiritual corruption, and one by one, the bathhouses vanished. Some were converted into bakeries, others just rotted away. A sad end for buildings meant to promote cleanliness. Meanwhile, in monasteries, monks quietly mourned the change. They'd kept up bathing schedules for generations, but now even that was in question. The church didn't ban hygiene outright, it just made staying clean incredibly difficult. And so began the golden age of dry cleaning. In the medieval world, soap became optional. water was treated with suspicion, and bathhouses became just another relic from a time when washing didn't come with risks. Even as the church grew increasingly uncomfortable with bare elbows, and the belief spread that hot baths could let the plague seep in through your pores, people didn't completely abandon bathing. They just reduced it to something you do once per season, or when your smell became self-aware. Let's start with the upper class. Yes, nobles did bathe, just not frequently enough for their rubber ducks to wrinkle. Their servants would haul in cauldrons of hot water, since indoor plumbing was still far in the future, and pour it into large wooden tubs lined with linen. Herbs like lavender or sage, or anything nearby that didn't smell like unwashed feet, were sprinkled in. This was less a bath and more of a stew. People sat in the tub, which was usually set up in a bedroom or near a fireplace. Privacy was optional, depending on your social rank or tolerance for shame. Some even bathed with their spouses, because nothing says romance like marinating together in shared grime. The lower classes bathed too, typically in rivers, barrels, or anything that could hold water and didn't bite. It wasn't about staying clean, it was about practicality. Might as well wash the kid, the shirt, and the goat at the same time was probably a popular saying. In the winter, survival took priority over cleanliness, so instead of bathing, people embraced a method best described as act clean and keep moving. Some urban bathhouses held on, particularly in southern Europe, where warmer weather and better infrastructure kept cleanliness within reach. These could be well maintained, with steam rooms and herbal treatments. Others offered services that were less Vatican approved. Regardless, you'd leave refreshed, lightly steamed, and maybe judged just a little. On special occasions, like after childbirth or while recovering from illness, people would take full baths. Because nothing says welcome to the world or please survive like being soaked in tepid rosemary water. When full-body baths became controversial due to the belief that hot water welcomed disease like a guest at a feast, people turned to the next best option, the sponge bath. Though actual sponges weren't common, at least not the soft, factory-made kind we're used to. Instead, linen cloth soaked in warm water, herbs or vinegar were used to wipe down the body like one might gently polish an antique chair. In this context, hygiene meant spot cleaning. If you were lucky, someone helped. If you were wealthy, someone helped, and wasn't thrilled about it. These quick washes focused on the essentials: hands, face, armpits, and sometimes feet. The high-traffic areas, so to speak. Underclothes, especially linen, absorbed sweat and grime. Changing your shirt regularly became the closest thing to modern hygiene. Your tunic might be stiff with use, but at least the underlayer was fresh. Of course, no one believed this was real cleanliness. But when water was scarce or feared, and people thought bathing could bring on the plague, it was the safer route. And in a world without deodorant, toothpaste or showers, wiping down with rose water or vinegar was the medieval version of a luxury spa, minus the spa and the luxury. For the rich, attendants might heat water, mix in herbs like rosemary or marjoram, and gently wash their masters or mistresses while pretending not to judge. Peasants boiled water over fires and ladled it into bowls for the same purpose, likely with more breeze and less politeness. Monks often had better hygiene routines than most. Many monastic orders had scheduled washings, even if those practices leaned more spiritual than sanitary. The result was similar either way: a quick rub-down, a bit of moisture, and the satisfaction of being just clean enough to not scare the livestock. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked more or less. At least until you had to ride for hours through mud. As for hair, if medieval strands had a motto, it would be flammable but fragrant. Despite common myths, people didn't go around with unintentional bird nests on their heads. They did wash their hair, just not often, and certainly not with anything like shampoo. So, what did they use? A mix of homemade brews that sounded like early spell ingredients. One popular method was lye soap, made from wood ash and animal fat, effective at removing oil, and also your scalp if overused. Combine that with questionable water quality, and you had something like a medieval chemical peel. What's your excuse now? To be fair, medieval people didn't completely neglect oral hygiene, they just didn't fully understand it. Still, they made a decent effort with what was available: cloth, charcoal, and a fair amount of blind optimism. Toothbrushes weren't around yet. That invention was still far in the future. Instead, They used linen cloths to wipe their teeth clean, ideally dipped in something abrasive like salt, crushed mint, or burnt rosemary ash. The goal wasn't a white smile, it was to survive. If your breath didn't knock someone over, you were ahead of the game. Some chewed on sticks from trees like hazel or elm. These twigs were frayed at one end to mimic a brush. You chewed until the fibres spread out, then used the end to scrub your teeth. Think of it as the original biodegradable toothbrush. Natural, compostable, and tasting vaguely of bark. To freshen their breath, people chewed fennel seeds, cloves, or cardamom, depending on what they could afford or managed to snag from the spice shelf. In wealthier circles, mouth rinses might include vinegar, wine, or myrrh water, because nothing says dental luxury like rinsing with a substance also used to embalm ancient royalty. And yes, something like toothpaste did exist. Some versions mixed powdered charcoal, crushed eggshells, and oyster shell ash with honey or oil to make a gritty paste. If it didn't leave your mouth cleaner, it at least left it feeling thoroughly sanded. As for dentists, if you could call them that, they were often barbers working on their off days. If a tooth was loose, rotten, or simply bothersome, the solution was straightforward. Pull it out. No anesthesia, no consultation, just a wooden chair, a firm hand, and a quick prayer. Aftercare. Maybe a rinse with wine and hope that infection took longer than your soul to exit your body. Despite all this, people weren't necessarily walking around toothless. Diets were low in processed sugar, and rural populations often had better teeth than modern-day snack lovers. But once decay set in, it spread quickly, and no amount of primitive paste could save you. Let's be honest. If you were suddenly dropped into a crowded medieval marketplace, your first reaction wouldn't be admiration. It would be nausea. Medieval Europe had a scent, and it was proud of it. There were no sewage systems, no deodorant, and barely any functioning bathtubs. The average street reeked of sweat, livestock, spoiled food, and misplaced optimism. If you managed to make it past the fish stalls and tanneries without gagging, you were doing better than most travellers. So how did people handle the sensory assault? They got inventive. Enter the pomander, a small hollow sphere filled with herbs and spices, worn on a chain or tucked into clothing. Like a medieval air freshener, it was filled with cloves, cinnamon, lavender or musk, and sometimes dipped in ambergris, whale vomit but fancy. These didn't clean the air so much as compete with it. Women often carried scented sachets in their bodices to mask their own odour and block others. Some braided herbs like rosemary or marjoram into their hair. It was part cleanliness, part fashion, and part spiritual pest repellent. Those with wealth might import perfumes from Italy or the Middle East, made with rose oil or civet, the latter sourced from the rear end of a very startled animal. Applying it involved careful dabbing, grand gestures, and pretending you weren't just masking the smell of turnips and despair. And then there were the environmental smells. Open sewers, barn animals, smoke from candles, and whatever meat byproducts the local butcher had just tossed into the street. Cities were wrapped in a constant cloud of stench. But no one really complained, because everyone smelled. It was a collective suffering, with undertones of garlic. The church promoted spiritual purity, but physical odour was left up to chance. If you smelled good, people assumed you were wealthy, or divine. If you didn't, well, you were just like everyone else. If you've ever forgotten deodorant and spent the day paranoid about your armpits, imagine that, but forever. No sprays, no roll-ons, and certainly nothing clinical strength. People just sweated, then made peace with it. Sort of. To handle the stench, they used a variety of tricks. One common remedy was alum powder, a natural mineral salt with mild antibacterial properties. It didn't stop sweating, but it helped with the smell, if you remembered to use it, and didn't mind grinding minerals into your skin. Other options included chalk, vinegar rinses, or crushed herbs. Sage, mint, and rosemary were popular, not because they worked, but because they smelled like something that didn't stink. The philosophy was simple. If you can't stop sweating, at least smell like a salad. Perfumed handkerchiefs were popular among the nobility, to discreetly hold under one's nose while walking through crowded streets. No one wanted to smell like boiled cabbage stew, but most people did. So you aimed for something closer to floral cabbage stew. Medicine didn't help much either. Physicians thought sweating was good, a way to expel bad humours. Blocking it was seen as suspicious or even dangerous. You were expected to stink. It was practically a sign of wellness. And then came the clothing. Layer upon layer of wool, linen and fur, trapping heat and odour like a walking sauna. Add in fireplaces, feasts and disease, and the air was thick with regret. But at least you weren't alone. Everyone smelled. The king, the clergy, even the lady selling vegetables who hadn't bathed since 12th night. Deodorant wasn't a thing, but shared stink, that was universal. With no showers, no gentle soaps, and no sprays that didn't involve a bunch of crushed herbs, medieval people relied on one surprising tool in their hygiene routine: linen. Not for eating on, for wearing. And the closer to the skin, the better. Linen undergarments were the silent heroes of the Middle Ages, breathable, absorbent, and tough. They were worn under the thick, heavy layers of wool and fur, soaking up the sweat and grime the body so generously produced. In a world that praised dryness but feared soap, the logic was brilliant. Wash the shirt, not the skin. Scrubbing your body? Risky, especially during plague years. Scrubbing your undershirt? Safe and blessed. People might go weeks without bathing, but they would change their linen, sometimes even twice a week, which, for the time, was nothing short of saintly. Clean linen was a status symbol. If your shirt was white and reasonably fresh, people thought you had your life together. If it was grey and crusty, you were poor, cursed, or maybe freshly resurrected. For women, the linen shift was crucial. It kept outer clothes cleaner and blocked the smell of sweat. Think of it as medieval Febreze, but with more judgment. Knights wore linen under armour to avoid roasting inside their own steel. Monks wore it under their robes. Even peasants had linen tunics, though often patched, thin, and held together with sheer determination. Washing linen wasn't easy. It meant boiling water, using lye, beating the fabric on rocks, and praying it didn't float downstream. But it was still less of a hassle than bathing, or dealing with the spiritual risk of showing too much skin. One thing that remained constant in medieval hygiene: itching. Not because of fabric allergies, though probably that too, but because everyone had uninvited guests. Lice, fleas, and mites were constant companions. Lice were so common, they were treated like background noise. Everyone had them. Rich, poor, drunk or devout. Lice didn't care. They were equal opportunity pests. So, what did people do? They combed. Lice combs made of bone or wood were as personal as today's toothbrush. But instead of cleaning your teeth, you were raking insects off your scalp, like harvesting a tiny, horrifying crop. The combs had fine teeth to catch the bugs, their eggs, and your last shred of dignity. Another method: boiling or baking clothes near the fire to kill the lice, assuming you didn't ruin your only outfit in the process. That's why some medieval art shows people holding shirts near flames. It wasn't laundry day, it was pest execution. Some people shaved their heads, especially monks or those bold enough to rock the bald look. It worked. No hair meant nowhere to hide. Wigs were sometimes worn over shaved heads, though those could also become infested if not cleaned properly. Fleas were another issue, especially with straw bedding or livestock nearby. No sprays, no collars, just smoke fumigation or tossing herbs between sheets. Some people believed certain scents would drive fleas away. Others just hoped to smell worse than their neighbour and become less appealing. But really it was about endurance. Everyone itched. Everyone scratched. It was as normal as taxes or stepping in something disgusting near the market. Now, the medieval toilet. A phrase that might be too generous. Bathroom time in the Middle Ages was more about creativity and reduced expectations than comfort. In castles, you had garderobes, small rooms with a hole in a stone bench. Waste dropped straight down, sometimes into a moat, sometimes into a pit, sometimes into a field someone forgot to mark. They were often built high in towers, for privacy and gravity. If you were under one, you learned fast to stay clear. Peasants had fewer luxuries. Most went outdoors, in the woods, by the river, or behind the barn. Some villages had shared pits, basically outhouses with no standards, and even less privacy. Conversations about crops might happen mid-squat. For nighttime needs, chamber pots were used, ceramic bowls kept near beds for midnight emergencies. If you've never relieved yourself into a freezing pot next to your sleeping relatives in total darkness, congratulations, you're not medieval. And what happened to the contents of those pots? They were tossed out the window, literally. With a friendly yell of "Guard Lou!" to warn those below, waste hit the street, ideally missing passers-by. But let's be honest, it often didn't. Street cleaning was left to gravity, weather and pigs. Cities had gutters or ditches to carry waste away, but they often clogged, overflowed, or just sat there, marinating. As for toilet paper, it didn't exist. People used rags, moss, straw, their hands, or for the lucky bits of wool or linen. In winter, snow sometimes did the job. Before bathing was deemed suspicious or sinful, public bathhouses were everywhere in Europe, and they weren't just about soap. They were the community's wellness centres. Think of them as medieval spas, with some plot twists. Bathhouses offered hot water, steam rooms, massages, food, music, and depending on the place, some rather questionable company. At their best, they were communal health hubs. At their worst, well, let's just say it wasn't all about hygiene. These places were steamy, bare-skinned hubs of gossip, indulgence, and mild scandal, sometimes all before midday. They were called stews, not just because people lingered in them too long, though that often happened, but because of the warm, misty water. Mixed-gender bathing wasn't rare, especially in countries like Germany or Italy, where social norms were a bit more lenient. It wasn't always suggestive. Families could attend together, and monks sometimes bathed in pairs. But human nature being what it is, lines blurred, as did the bath water. Naturally, this drew attention from the church. Religious leaders cautioned that shared bathing led to sin, and to be fair, it often did. Some bathhouses gradually evolved into brothels with plumbing. The water got steamy, and not just from the fire under the tub. Then came the plagues, and everything shifted. When devastating illnesses like the Black Death swept through Europe, bathhouses were quickly blamed. Physicians of the time believed that open pores allowed disease to enter the body, and since warm baths opened the pores, the connection seemed obvious, at least in a world that didn't understand germs. Bathhouses began closing, their reputations collapsed. Public bathing suddenly became something to avoid altogether. Some areas managed to keep the practice alive a bit longer. Southern Europe, the Middle East, and certain port cities continued their bathing traditions for decades. But in Northern and Central Europe, public bathhouses disappeared quickly, faster than one's dignity after slipping into a shared tub. What remained was a mixture of nostalgia and suspicion. Bathhouses had once been vibrant social spaces, but they came to represent sin, sickness, and bad choices. By the 1500s, communal soaking was largely a thing of the past. People were now dabbing their armpits with vinegar and quietly hoping someone would invent soap that didn't smell like livestock. Soap in medieval times was a lot like the medicine of the day, harsh, unpredictable, and likely to make you regret the whole experience. Technically, it worked, but using it felt more like a punishment than a cleaning routine. The standard recipe included animal fat and lye, or, in fancier terms, rendered tallow and wood ash. Mixed together, they created a substance that could remove dirt, grease, and maybe your will to live. Early soap wasn't sold in pastel bars with gentle floral scents. It came in hard, waxy clumps that resembled things you'd try not to step in. Making it required patience and a strong constitution. Boil down sheep or pig fat, mix in alkaline ash water, and wait for the mixture to harden into solid blocks. Adding herbs like lavender or rosemary could give it a nicer scent, but overall, the result still smelled like wet smoke and disappointment. Soap was primarily reserved for laundry and serious scrubbing, not for daily use on the body. Skin was seen as delicate, and lye soap could turn a bath into a stinging ordeal. Still, people used it when necessary, before major events like weddings, court appearances, or when a plague came to town. Higher quality soaps came from the Islamic world and southern Europe, especially Castile soap from Spain, which used olive oil instead of animal fat. These soaps were milder and much more pleasant, making them luxury items for those who didn't already smell like barnyard. For most people, though, soap was functional, not enjoyable. It was used on clothes, dishes, or exceptionally dirty hands. Not part of a daily habit, more like a monthly ritual. Some people rarely, if ever, used soap and didn't consider it a problem. After all, everyone else was doing the same. When the whole village smells, expectations lower accordingly. Laundry in medieval Europe was more than a household task. It was a physical workout, a public event, and a test of your ability to survive the weather. Forget laundromats. If you wanted clean clothes, you had to boil them, beat them, and hope for sunshine. Most washing happened in rivers, which sounds charming, until you remember that the same rivers were used as sewers, watering holes, and disposal sites for anything unpleasant. Step 1 was soaking your garments in lye or urine. Yes, actual urine. Collected and stored until it turned into chamber lye, prized for its ammonia content. Great for lifting stains, not so great for your nose. After soaking, the clothes were hauled to the river, scrubbed on wooden boards or large flat rocks, then beaten with paddles. A process known as fulling. This wasn't gentle cleaning. It was more like an interrogation. It could take hours and usually required a team of washerwomen known for their endurance and arm strength. Next came rinsing, wringing and drying, which depended on the weather. If it rained, you waited another day and hoped your shirt didn't develop a new personality. Clothes were spread over bushes, hedges, or hung between trees and houses. Medieval towns looked like permanent yard sales. Not everyone did their own laundry. The wealthy had servants. Monasteries had assigned workers. Some towns had professional washers. But for the average person, it was all DIY. Interestingly, clean clothing mattered more than a clean body. You might not have bathed for weeks, but if your undergarments were fresh, relatively speaking, you were considered socially acceptable. In many cases, laundry was the hygiene. After all this, the combing, the washing, the vinegar rubbing, it's fair to ask, did medieval hygiene actually work? Or was everyone just one sweaty shirt away from combustion? In short, it worked enough. Not by modern standards. If you travelled back to 1347, your nose would probably stage a rebellion. But by their standards, people weren't clueless, just working with a different definition of cleanliness. They had systems, even if those involved vinegar soaks and flinging waste out the window. They had tools, combs, linen layers, herbal rinses, ash-based soaps. They had routines too. Sponge baths before Sunday services or boiling clothes during a full moon. Their hygiene practices were tied up in superstition, spirituality and survival. They made do, balancing cleanliness with the fear of disease, divine punishment, or both. Some practices were surprisingly effective. Linen underclothing was smart. Herbal rinses had antibacterial benefits. Bathhouses were great, until they turned into disease zones. Sure, people smelled. They scratched. They shared everything from baths to lice. But many still lived into old age, or at least to the next harvest. Cleanliness wasn't just about health. It was a social signal. Fresh clothes meant respectability. Tidy hair showed discipline. Avoiding visible decay was just basic courtesy. Medieval hygiene worked the way balancing a cart with rope works. Barely, but somehow. Now picture walking through a city of 40,000, the crown of the Indus Valley civilization. If you're expecting mud huts and chaos, think again. Mohenjo-Daro, built around 2500 BCE, was so well organised that modern city planners might cry in admiration. It wasn't haphazard. Streets were arranged in a grid, actual right angles. Roads ran north-south and east-west, cleanly intersecting to form a planned network. But the genius didn't stop at street level. Beneath the surface lay something many cities still struggle with: underground drainage. Mohenjo-Daro had a proper sewer system. Almost every home, no matter how modest, had access to water and drains. Wastewater flowed into covered channels lining the streets. It's like the ancient residents were saying, yes, sanitation actually matters. The city wasn't just functional, it was intentional. The raised citadel likely housed religious or administrative elites, while the lower areas served everyday residents. The famed Great Bath points to ritual and possibly recreation, not just survival, but meaning and purpose built into clay bricks. Markets lined the main roads. Homes varied in size, showing class differences, but even simple houses had private wells and toilets. Let that sink in. 4,000 years ago, even the poor had plumbing. Meanwhile, in 19th century Europe, people were still tossing waste into the street. Then the city faded. No evidence of invasion, no burning, just quiet abandonment. Climate change, disrupted trade, we don't know, but the legacy remains. A city designed with thought, care, and a clear grasp of the importance of clean water and civic order. And all without an urban planning office. If Mohenjo-Daro was the meticulous accountant of ancient cities, then Babylon was the dramatic performer. Grand, legendary, and steeped in story. It rose and fell many times, but at its peak in the 6th century BCE under Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon was the jewel of Mesopotamia. Don't let the myths fool you. This wasn't chaos. Babylon was carefully planned. It had towering walls and iconic gates, none more famous than the Ishtar Gate, a dazzling blue entryway adorned with lions and mythical creatures. It looked like something from a dream. But the gate wasn't just for decoration. It marked the beginning of a processional road, a sacred route straight through the heart of the city. This road wasn't just functional, it was ceremonial. During major festivals like Akitu, gods were paraded along it. The route linked the towering ziggurat of Etemenanki, possibly the inspiration for the Tower of Babel, with the grand temple of Marduk. Urban design here blended faith and propaganda. You didn't just live in Babylon, you walked through its sacred story. Each day, Babylon's streets followed the curves of the river and the natural shape of the land, yet they were smartly organised. Residential areas, temple grounds, gardens, marketplaces and administrative zones were all thoughtfully arranged. The Euphrates River cut through the city, providing not just water but a vital trade route, and admittedly a chance to show off. There were drainage systems, though not as advanced as those in the Indus Valley. Still, homes featured bathrooms with clay pipes and canals that carried wastewater away. Babylonian engineers clearly knew what they were doing. Even the bricks were stamped with the king's name. Because if you're building sewers, why not leave your mark? Babylon was crafted to impress, both people and gods. Every gate, every street, every temple delivered a message. Behold my greatness, and marvel at the planning permits. People noticed. Even Alexander the Great considered making Babylon his capital. After walking its god-sized boulevards, Athens likely felt modest in comparison. Nearly 1,000 years before the Aztecs gazed in awe at its ruins and named it Teotihuacan, the place where gods were born, this ancient Mexican city had already mastered city design. At its height, around 500 CE, Teotihuacan housed more than 100,000 people and ranked among the largest cities on Earth. Unlike the sprawling chaos of many modern metropolises, Teotihuacan was built with the precision of someone who took sacred geometry very seriously. The Avenue of the Dead, despite its grim title, courtesy of the Aztecs, wasn't a burial ground but a ceremonial boulevard over 2 miles long. It served as the city's central spine lined with temples, plazas, elite homes and thriving markets. It connected the Pyramid of the Moon in the north to the massive Pyramid of the Sun. Even more remarkable was the city's orientation. Teotihuacan followed a grid tilted roughly 15.5 degrees off true north, possibly to align with celestial events or sacred geography. It wasn't random, it was cosmologically informed planning. Zoning was deliberate. Residential complexes were arranged in modular blocks, each housing extended families and offering shared patios and drainage systems. Some compounds were ornately decorated, indicating wealth. Others were simpler, reflecting working-class life. This was more than a city. It was society etched into stone and plaster. Teotihuacan also featured an advanced water management system. Canals and drains traced the roads and wound through homes, helping manage seasonal floods. The engineers understood their environment and adapted accordingly. They likely had zero patience for potholes. Much about the city's leadership remains unknown, how it was governed or who held power, but one thing is clear. It was built to impress both human eyes and celestial alignments. Teotihuacan was a monument to balance, ritual fused with rationality. When the Aztecs stumbled upon its ruins centuries later, they didn't just admire them, they assumed gods had built the city. Given the symmetry, It's hard to blame them. When we discuss ancient urban planning, we often imagine a single mastermind, a lone architect with a vision and a scroll, but in the Indus Valley civilization, it seems the design wasn't top-down. It emerged from a shared cultural consensus so strong that cities like Harappa and Lothal displayed strikingly similar layouts. These weren't sister cities, they were architectural twins, and that's deeply revealing. Take Harappa in present-day Pakistan. Like Mohenjo-daro, it followed a grid pattern, used uniform brick sizes, and had clear zones for living, administration and production. Advanced drainage systems were standard, with homes connected to street drains through private channels or terracotta pipes. This wasn't just hygiene, it was dignity, ensuring clean water and waste removal for all citizens. Then there's Lothal near the Arabian Sea. It raised the bar even higher with port infrastructure. Lothal had a dockyard, possibly the world's first, featuring a vast basin and sluice gates to manage water flow. It wasn't a basic riverside post. It was a trade hub engineered for tides and currents. Venice had nothing on it. What's more remarkable, there's no evidence of monarchs' royal palaces or military strongholds, no statues of rulers, no grand inscriptions boasting conquest. These cities seem to have been governed by efficient councils or administrators focused on trade, sanitation and ritual. Their authority came from logistics, not bloodlines. Artifacts like standardized weights and scales point to a highly regulated economy. Marketplaces and workshops were precisely zoned. It's easy to imagine ancient planners debating warehouse placement or sewer width, and those choices held across vast distances. Homes weren't built just for the elite. The consistent access to water, public wells and private bathrooms shows an urban philosophy based on equity, not hierarchy. The architects of these cities weren't just shaping streets, they were designing a civic ideal, where organisation wasn't an option but a value. Today, when we think of zoning, we picture city boards fighting over driveways and Airbnb complaints. But the concept of dividing space into zones for living, working, worshipping, and waste isn't new. It's ancient, and surprisingly widespread. Cities like Mohenjo-daro, Babylon, and Teotihuacan weren't just random building clusters. They were intentional blueprints, with logic behind their layout. In Mohenjo-daro, the elevated citadel held public baths, granaries, and possible government structures. Below lay wide residential areas, divided by large avenues. Kilns and workshops were placed at the outskirts, far from homes, where smoke and noise wouldn't intrude. It was zoning based on common sense, and it repeated across Indus cities. In Babylon, zoning took on symbolic power. Temples and palaces dominated the central zones. Administrative offices and noble homes clustered nearby. Markets and commoners lived further out, but the underlying design remained consistent. A city arranged with both spiritual and practical order. Teotihuacan refined zoning into near-perfect structure. A strict grid defined sectors: residential, religious, commercial and industrial. Even immigrant communities had their own districts, complete with architecture matching their homelands. It was zoning with multicultural awareness in 500 CE. What this tells us is simple. These weren't just settlements, they were ideological spaces. Where you lived, prayed and worked was carefully determined by people who understood human flow, social dynamics and possibly divine alignment. And no, they didn't use apps or satellite imaging, just observation, engineering, and maybe a divine hint. Because any society that manages zoning without online backlash or lawsuits, they were way ahead of the curve. We often imagine the ancient world as a messy, muddy place, with overflowing waste, crowded alleys, and the unmistakable stench of unwashed humanity. But in truth, some ancient cities took sanitation seriously, far more than even parts of 19th century Europe. Take Mohenjo-daro again. Nearly every home had a private washroom, often with a sloped floor to guide water out. Wastewater flowed into covered drains. Yes, covered. Made from brick and fitted with cleaning access points. These drains ran beneath almost every street, channeling waste away from homes. This was municipal plumbing before the term even existed. Now compare that to Babylon, where hygiene was more symbolic than systemic. The city had canals and some drainage, and elite buildings featured clay pipes, but most citizens relied on cesspits, ditches and divine mercy. Still, wealthier homes did have indoor bathrooms, and some records hint at basic flushing systems, likely involving buckets and timing. Then there's Teotihuacan. While it didn't prioritise drainage like the Indus cities, it still featured stormwater canals and sewage routes in wealthier zones. Residential compounds often had built-in drainage, and major buildings included designated toilet areas. Cleanliness was more than comfort. It was likely tied to religious purity, especially in ceremonial spaces like temples and along the Avenue of the Dead. Even smaller cities like Lothal and Harappa showed a deep grasp of water systems, with wells, reservoirs and carefully sloped roads that handled seasonal rains. Imagine designing an entire city with gravity in mind and pulling it off in 2400 BCE. What's most impressive here isn't the technology, it's the mindset. These civilizations saw water as more than utility. It was something to respect, share and manage. Hygiene wasn't reserved for the elite, it was a civic priority, baked into the blueprints. Modern cities still wrestle with sanitation. These ancient places, they were laying bricks and digging trenches thousands of years ago, quietly reminding us, plumbing is a mark of civilization. If temples were where people addressed the gods, markets were where they negotiated with each other, and probably argued over onions. Every major ancient city we've explored had a lively economic centre, thoughtfully integrated into the layout. In Babylon, markets weren't an afterthought. They were central and structured. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the world's oldest legal documents, contained strict laws governing trade, weights and merchant conduct. Markets unfolded beneath porticos and in open-air courtyards. People sold grain, wine, fabric, animals and slaves, while scribes recorded deals and tracked debts. This wasn't casual shopping, it was regulated commerce. Teotihuacan's economy was equally vibrant. Giant market plazas, especially near the Ciudadela complex, drew thousands. Here, people traded obsidian, salt, cacao, feathers and ceramics. Unlike the tightly controlled temple economies seen in other regions, Teotihuacan's market seemed more decentralized. Neighborhood-driven, with different sectors focusing on specific trades. It was like a massive physical Etsy, except your seller lived down the block. In Mohenjo-Daro and other Indus sites, market avenues sat near storage buildings and workshops. Archaeologists have found standardized weights and scales, proving the economy was not only active but regulated. Even goods from Mesopotamia have turned up, including seals and jewels, hinting at long-distance trade. Picture a fish seller accepting Mesopotamian currency and not blinking. But markets weren't just for trade. They were social centres. In Babylon, they were places to catch up on rumours, settle arguments, and spot who was wearing the latest Assyrian fashion. In Teotihuacan, markets served as cultural crossroads, where merchants and travellers from afar mingled beneath towering pyramids. Even the Indus cities, which lacked towering temples or royal palaces, placed economic zones at the centre of urban life. Trade sparked innovation. It demanded roads, regulation, and record-keeping. And ancient city planners answered not with chaos but with order. Behind every sacred shrine or fortress wall, a vendor was likely shouting, "Best deal in town!" In the ancient world, city design wasn't just about plumbing and shopping stalls. It was about honouring the divine. Temples weren't tucked away. They dominated skylines, sat atop the highest ground, and claimed the most important plots of land. If markets were a city's pulse, temples were its soul, and planners ensured their presence was unmistakable. Consider Babylon. Its skyline was pierced by the Etemenanki ziggurat, a massive step tower made of brick, built in honour of the god Marduk. This wasn't a modest shrine. It was a colossal gesture, said to rise over 90 metres. Its purpose was more than worship. It was urban symbolism. Roads led to it, rituals centred around it, and the city's form revolved around its sacred presence. Teotihuacan followed the same principle. The pyramids of the sun and moon weren't just ceremonial landmarks, they anchored the city. The Avenue of the Dead, aligned with astronomical patterns and possibly solstices, linked these structures. From residences to marketplaces, everything radiated out from these pyramids. They were not decorations, They were cosmological coordinates directing movement and meaning. Mohenjo-Daro, by contrast, didn't feature tall temples or pyramids. Instead, it gave us the Great Bath, a large water tank possibly used for spiritual cleansing. This wasn't a leisure pool. It was engineered with waterproof bricks, an advanced drainage system, and likely tied to beliefs around ritual purity and renewal. No idols, no grandeur, just water, geometry, and silence. In all these cities, sacred sites were deliberately placed and practically connected. Temples weren't isolated. They linked with processional routes, public spaces, and government buildings. Religion wasn't separate from civic life. It was embedded within it. Urban planning reflected this unity. These weren't cities with temples. They were sacred landscapes wearing the mask of cities. Every road, wall, and courtyard was choreographed in spiritual rhythm. Because in ancient times, building a city was an offering, and the divine always got the prime location. It's easy to think of modern cities as born from engineering, blueprints, and university degrees. But dig beneath the asphalt, and you'll find the foundation of urban life was laid long before concrete mixers and CAD software. The building blocks of urban design, grids, districts, sanitation, civic spaces, and sacred zones, were shaped thousands of years ago by planners we too often underestimate. Take drainage systems. Mohenjo-Daro didn't just dig ditches, it created a tiered system of waste removal that flowed through homes and beneath streets. The notion of universal sanitation, still elusive in many regions today, was standard in this Bronze Age hub. Babylon established a framework for regulated trade, civic systems, and the use of space to communicate spiritual and political authority. Teotihuacan offered a cosmic blueprint, where roads, plazas, and temples aligned with celestial movements. Its design blended architecture and astronomy, embedding spiritual rhythms into daily routines. These weren't mere settlements, they were philosophical constructs. Then there's the psychological effect. Ancient cities shaped human behaviour. Broad avenues enabled processions and parades. Enclosed courtyards fostered community. Zoning didn't just organise space, it influenced how people gathered, where they worshipped, and how they viewed authority. The city's design was a message. It told citizens what was sacred, where to come together, and how to live in harmony, or at least try. Modern city planning owes much to this ancient wisdom. Manhattan's grid, Amsterdam's sanitation, the evolution from temple to cathedral to town hall, all trace their lineage to these ancestral blueprints. We still measure land, centre our cities on commerce, faith, and ceremony. What's changed is the tech, not the thinking. We now use machines to raise skyscrapers and lay roads, but the core is the same. Cities are stories told in stone, metal, and concrete. And the first chapters of that story were carved with copper, guided by star charts, and held together by a belief that well-planned space leads to a well-lived life. So next time you walk a city street, remember, you're not just walking through infrastructure. You're moving through 4,000 years of accumulated vision, echoing beneath your feet. Hadrian wasn't born in the centre of Rome, but on its western edge. He entered the world in 76 CE in Italica, a Romanised town in Hispania Baetica, today's southern Spain. Though far from the capital, Hadrian's family was anything but provincial. Wealthy, high-ranking, and deeply Roman in culture and ambition, they held close ties to power, most notably through Hadrian's paternal connection to Marcus Ulpius Trajanus, who would later become Emperor Trajan. Hadrian lost both parents around the age of 10, a formative loss that placed him under the guardianship of Trajan and Publius Acilius Attianus, a Roman knight. These two men would play major roles in shaping his future. While many young Roman nobles followed the traditional paths of military or political life, Hadrian was drawn to Greek learning, literature, and art. He read Homer obsessively, spoke Greek fluently, and preferred scrolls over swords, at least in his youth. But Rome wasn't ruled by poetry. Like all aristocrats with ambition, Hadrian had to serve. He began his career as a military tribune, first in Lower Moesia, then Upper Moesia, and finally Pannonia. He proved capable in command, but his real strengths lay in governance and diplomacy. Trajan's rise to emperor in 98 CE marked a turning point. Despite occasional tension between them, Hadrian could be sharp-tongued, prideful, and overly intellectual, Trajan kept him close. Hadrian moved through the cursus honorum, quaestor, tribune of the plebs, and on through the Roman political ranks. He also married well, Vibia Sabina, Trajan's grand niece. The match was politically smart, though likely cold and distant. Hadrian's deeper bonds leaned toward philosophical friendship and male companionship, especially his eventual beloved Antinous. Hadrian's early life balanced between the expected life of a Roman general and his passion for art and thought. He was a man raised at the edge of empire but born to rule it, not by brute force, but by refinement. When Trajan fell seriously ill in 117 CE, the question of succession grew urgent. Though Hadrian had long been a part of imperial circles, Trajan had never named him heir publicly. So when Trajan died in Selinus, Asia Minor, a letter promptly arrived in Rome declaring Hadrian had been adopted as his son and successor on the emperor's deathbed, witnessed by Trajan's wife Plotina and the loyal Attianus. The timing raised eyebrows. Some accused Plotina of fabricating the adoption. But regardless of rumour, the Senate confirmed Hadrian, and on August 11th, 117 CE, he became emperor. The transition was rocky. The empire had expanded dramatically under Trajan, especially in the east, but those conquests were fragile. Hadrian, ever the realist, reversed course. He withdrew Roman forces from Armenia and Mesopotamia, choosing consolidation over ambition. This enraged many in the Senate and army, who viewed it as a betrayal. Then came the executions. 4 senators who had opposed Hadrian's rise were put to death on vague charges. Hadrian denied involvement, blaming Attianus, but the damage to his reputation with the Senate was lasting. Still, Hadrian made his priorities clear early in his reign. He cancelled debts, gave aid to the poor, and secured loyalty among the legions with generous payments. He shifted Rome's focus inward, away from conquest and toward consolidation, infrastructure, and peace. Hadrian didn't want to rule from afar. Unlike most emperors, he wanted to see the empire. Early in his reign, he began travelling, not as a formality, but as hands-on leadership. He wanted to inspect, mend, negotiate, and build. Between 121 and 125 CE, Hadrian visited Gaul, Germania, Britannia, Hispania, Africa, Greece, and Asia Minor, often on foot, side by side with soldiers. In Britannia, facing unrest along the northern frontier, he pulled back the borders and constructed his most famous project, Hadrian's Wall, a 73-mile barrier across northern England. It was both physical and psychological, a message that Rome would protect its own, not chase endless expansion. In Africa, he oversaw forts and roads. In Asia Minor, he funded temples and civic buildings. In Egypt, he was revered as a god and almost drowned in the Nile. But his favourite stop was always Greece. Hadrian adored Greek culture, its thought, aesthetics, and traditions. He participated in the Eleusinian mysteries, supported philosophers, and embraced his nickname Graeculus. In Athens, he completed the long-delayed temple of Olympian Zeus, funded libraries, and tried to unite Greek cities through cultural pride. His travels weren't vacations, they were policy, diplomacy, and architecture in motion. He reminded each province that they mattered, that Rome's emperor walked their roads, visited their temples, and understood their lands. Hadrian didn't just explore the empire, he reshaped it. A lover of construction, he left behind a legacy of monumental architecture. Aqueducts, arches, baths, and cities bore his stamp. His greatest legacy in Rome was the Pantheon, rebuilt under his rule around 126 CE. With its massive dome and central oculus, it became a marvel of engineering and a symbol of divine harmony, the sky rendered in stone. Then came his villa at Tivoli, not just a retreat but a living gallery of empire. He recreated Egyptian colonnades, Greek stoas, and even canals resembling the Nile. This was no ordinary palace. It was a curated world, an emperor's mind turned into marble. Across the empire he launched building campaigns, granaries in Africa, roads in Spain, temples in Anatolia. In Jerusalem he controversially rebuilt the city as Aelia Capitolina. enraging the Jewish population, a decision with consequences. Hadrian's architectural style was eclectic. Arches, symmetry, domes, but also local influence. He didn't impose Roman identity, he blended it. For Hadrian, buildings were more than stone. They were philosophy, empire, and identity in physical form. Among all those who accompanied Hadrian, none left a greater mark on his heart than Antinous, a beautiful youth from Bithynia. Their relationship, tender and controversial, became mythic. Antinous appeared around 124 CE, a quiet, handsome teenager who became Hadrian's closest companion, especially during his tours of Greece and Egypt. Their bond, widely seen as romantic, stood out not just for its intensity, but for Hadrian's public grief when Antinous died. In 130 CE, while sailing the Nile, Antinous drowned. Accounts differ: accident, suicide, or ritual sacrifice. But Hadrian's mourning was open and overwhelming. In response, Hadrian deified him, founding the city of Antinopolis near the death site and spreading his worship across the empire. Statues, coins, temples, and festivals followed. Antinous became a symbol of youth, beauty, and divine loss, almost a pagan saint. No imperial lover had ever been honoured so widely. Hadrian's grief became public mythology, and through Antinous he immortalised love itself. But Hadrian's reign wasn't all art and poetry. It also saw war, most fiercely in the Bar Kokhba revolt, the largest Jewish uprising against Roman rule. Trouble began when Hadrian tried to refound Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina, a Roman colony dedicated to Jupiter, reportedly atop the ruins of the Second Temple. Whether naive or deliberate, the act was seen as desecration. In 132 CE, rebellion erupted under Simon Bar Kokhba, hailed by some Jews as the Messiah. His forces seized Jerusalem and declared an independent state, issuing coins and enforcing Jewish law. Hadrian, initially caught off guard, responded with severity. He summoned top generals, including Sextus Julius Severus, recalled from Britain, and prepared for a long and brutal campaign. What followed was a brutal campaign of counterinsurgency. Roman forces razed village after village, using scorched earth strategies, siege warfare, and mass executions. Rebels and civilians suspected of supporting them were shown no mercy. By 135 CE, the revolt had been crushed. Bar Kokhba was dead. The province lay in ruins. Roman sources claim that over 500,000 Jews were killed, with many more enslaved. Judea was renamed Syria Palestina, an intentional effort to sever Jewish ties to the land. Jewish religious practices were suppressed, and the population was scattered across the empire. Hadrian, the emperor of architecture, culture, and restraint, had shown his capacity for unforgiving force. His rule over Judea would be remembered not for marble or order, but for fire, destruction, and exile. It was a grim reminder that the man who loved books, gods, and beauty could still wield the hard edge of Roman power. After years of tireless travel, magnificent building projects, and a reign shaped by both diplomacy and destruction, Hadrian began to fade. His final years were marked by illness, sorrow, and a growing awareness that even emperors cannot outwalk time. The man who had marched through the empire now remained mostly confined to his villa. The once active philosopher king turned inward, morose and contemplative. By 133 CE, he was battling a chronic condition, likely heart or kidney disease, based on accounts of bloating, weakness, and laboured breathing. He grew short-tempered, depressed, and increasingly preoccupied with death. He composed poems on mortality, often bleak and intimate. One of the most enduring, Animula Vagula Blandula, was a quiet farewell to his soul, a reflection on the limits of power and the fragility of life. Still, one task remained: choosing a successor. Hadrian had no biological heir, and his judgment was clouded by personal emotion. In 136 CE, he adopted Lucius Sionius Commodus, better known as Lucius Aelius Caesar, a relatively unknown senator, known for his charm but also his poor health. Many questioned the choice. He seemed too fragile, too refined, not built for rule. Their doubts proved valid. Just months after his adoption, Aelius died. likely of tuberculosis. Hadrian was heartbroken, and once again left scrambling to secure succession. Time running short, he made a more traditional decision. He adopted the respected senator Titus Aurelius Antoninus in 138 CE, but with one condition: Antoninus must adopt Marcus Annius Verus, the young man destined to become Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor. In that one move, Hadrian secured not just one, but 2 generations of stable leadership. It was a final stroke of political foresight, though it did little to ease his own suffering. Retreating to his beloved villa at Tivoli, Hadrian spent his last days among statues, memories, and the lingering absence of Antinous. His health deteriorated. Despair grew. He reportedly attempted suicide more than once, stopped only by those attending him. His death came in July 138 CE, at the age of 62. His ashes were placed in the mausoleum he built for himself, a towering cylindrical structure by the Tiber, later known as Castel Sant'Angelo. When Hadrian died, he left behind an empire not larger than before, but more stable, unified, and intellectually enriched. His legacy wasn't conquest, like Trajan's, it was cohesion, and that, in its own way, was radical. In an age obsessed with military glory, Hadrian dared to look inward. His most visible legacy still stands. Hadrian's wall stretches across northern Britain, a physical and philosophical border. It didn't say, Rome conquers here. It said, Rome ends here, and we know it. It was a boundary of strength and wisdom, not aggression. In the capital, the rebuilt Pantheon marked a milestone in architectural history. Its massive dome, the largest of its kind, made from reinforced concrete, honoured both engineering and imagination. A structure not just for the gods, but for the idea of what Rome could achieve. His villa at Tivoli, with its libraries, gardens, and reconstructed wonders of the empire, became the template for Renaissance estates. It was Hadrian's dream of Rome made physical, a world empire transformed into one man's curated landscape. But his legacy wasn't only brick and marble. He reshaped governance. He revised laws, reorganized the military into a more defensive force, and redefined the role of the emperor. He travelled not to impress, but to understand, and created a model of responsibility for those who followed. His love for Greek culture inspired a revival of Hellenic thought, art, and tradition throughout the empire. The man once mocked as Greekulus had re-Hellenized Rome, not through conquest, but through admiration. And politically, his decision to name Antoninus Pius, and indirectly Marcus Aurelius, ushered in the Pax Antoniniana, an era of unmatched peace and prosperity. Yet Hadrian remained a man of contradictions, a builder who devastated Judea, a lover of peace with a brutal edge, a poet-emperor who governed with cold realism. His Rome was not just a city of strength, but of thought, legacy, and measurement. Hadrian didn't merely rule Rome, he redefined the role of ruler. His reign marked a shift, the moment when the emperor evolved from military commander to curator of civilization. He projected imperial power through presence, not just expansion. He walked the empire, visited its borders, inspected aqueducts, and debated with philosophers. He made visibility a form of authority. Future emperors followed this example. Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius governed not through force but stewardship. Marcus Aurelius, the author of Meditations, might never have ruled as a philosopher if Hadrian hadn't shown that intellect could belong on a throne. But Hadrian also wielded authority with precision. He was revered and feared, cultured yet harsh. His reign was relatively calm, but when pushed, his responses were surgical and absolute. Executions, suppression, exile. Privately he was introspective, melancholic. His poems revealed a man who grappled with mortality and the cost of power. His love for Antinous, elevated to divinity, mourned through sculpture and temple, added a human layer to his legend. Through that grief we glimpse his vulnerability, an emperor touched by loss. Even in death, Hadrian crafted a presence that endured. His mausoleum, Castel Sant'Angelo, became an unmissable symbol in Rome's skyline. His buildings still stand, his laws influenced generations, his travels stitched together an empire that, for a time, felt whole. Hadrian's greatness wasn't in what he conquered, but in what he preserved, built, and imagined. He was an emperor of paradox, crowned with laurel, armed with reason. architect and ruler, poet and realist, mortal and monument. In the end, Hadrian left behind more than structures. He left behind a philosophy of empire, and a model of rule that still echoes in Rome's ruins and in the footsteps of those who wander through them. In 1703, President Thomas Jefferson doubled the size of the United States with the stroke of a pen. The Louisiana Purchase, a $15 million deal with France, added over 800,000 square miles of largely unmapped land to the young republic. It was a geopolitical triumph, but also a cartographic mystery. What exactly had the United States acquired? Mountains, rivers, passable trade routes, dangerous wildlife, monsters? Jefferson had no idea, but he was determined to find out. And so, he turned to Meriwether Lewis, his private secretary and a man with boundless curiosity, a scientific mind, and a passion for uncharted adventure. Jefferson personally selected him to lead the expedition that would chart the newly acquired territory, survey its geography, catalogue its plants and animals, and, most critically, determine whether the legendary Northwest Passage, a water route to the Pacific, truly existed. But Lewis wouldn't go alone. He chose his longtime friend and military companion William Clark to share command. While Lewis brought scientific curiosity and diplomatic tact, Clark offered military discipline, cartographic expertise, and a natural rapport with the men. Jefferson believed this balance was crucial. Though Lewis was the only one with an official commission, they would act as equals, a unity that would become one of their greatest strengths. Preparations began at once. Jefferson issued meticulous instructions: study the terrain, foster relationships with native tribes, document flora and fauna, and quietly assert American influence in lands already inhabited by dozens of indigenous nations. Diplomacy cloaked in scientific inquiry. Supplies were gathered: compasses, sextants, microscopes, gifts for tribal leaders such as beads, mirrors, and peace medals, and even a collapsible iron boat that never quite worked but looked promising on paper. Dozens of men, mostly from the US Army, were recruited. They would form the Corps of Discovery, a name as bold as the mission itself. The expedition departed Camp Dubois near St. Louis in May 1804. Ahead lay thousands of miles of uncharted wilderness, countless native nations, and a mission with no guarantee of return. For Jefferson, Lewis, and Clark, the real reward wasn't just land. It was knowledge, the kind of knowledge that could shape the future of the Republic and define its character. And so, with blank journals and unmapped terrain before them, the Corps of Discovery embarked on their journey, chasing a vision glimpsed only in Jefferson's boldest hopes. On May 14th, 1804, the Corps of Discovery pushed off from the Missouri River's banks, beginning a 2-year odyssey through lands few Americans had ever seen. Their launch was quiet, no parades, no fanfare. Just 33 men in a keelboat and 2 pirogues, carrying nearly 10 tons of supplies, heading upstream into the unknown. Progress was slow. Though the Missouri was their main route westward, it was anything but gentle. Shifting sandbars, swift currents, and dense forests turned every mile into a grind. They pushed forward with poles, ropes, oars, and sheer willpower, sometimes inching along as though rowing through wet cement. The crew was a rugged mix: seasoned frontiersmen, skilled hunters, French-Canadian boatmen, and soldiers with more grit than polish. Among them was York, Clark's enslaved servant, whose strength and presence would earn him great respect among native tribes. There was also Charles Floyd, a sergeant whose fate would serve as a sobering reminder of the dangers ahead. Discipline set in fast. Clark meticulously mapped every twist of the river, while Lewis, ever the naturalist, catalogued plants, animals, and geological formations with obsessive detail. Each day brought new discoveries: majestic bald eagles, elk, and fish, along with nuisances like gnats, ticks, and clouds of biting flies. By late summer, the expedition reached what is now Iowa and South Dakota. Here, the plains opened into vast prairies beneath an endless sky. It was also where they had their first significant encounters with native peoples, including the Otto and Missouri tribes, followed by the formidable Teton Sioux. These meetings were often tense. The Americans arrived bearing peace medals and flags, symbols of goodwill, but also subtle declarations of power. The message was clear: a new nation had entered the landscape, yet beneath smiles there was mistrust. The expedition was outnumbered, often outgunned, and knew that diplomacy wasn't a choice. It was their lifeline. Despite the tension, through careful tact and physical resilience, the Corps pressed onward. Winter was still ahead, but the tone had been set. The journey would require endurance, humility, and an unbreakable will, and the Missouri had only begun to show its true nature. By autumn 1704, the river had begun to freeze, and the expedition had travelled more than 1,000 miles from St. Louis. They knew they wouldn't reach the Rockies before winter locked the land. It was time to stop, regroup, and survive. They chose a site near present-day Washburn, North Dakota, just downstream from the Mandan and Hidatsa villages. These native communities were well established, with permanent earth lodges, rich agricultural lands, and diplomatic experience gained from hosting French, British, and Spanish traders. Now it was the Americans' turn to be the newcomers. Here, Lewis and Clark ordered their men to construct a winter base, Fort Mandan, named in honour of their hosts. Rising from the frozen prairie, the fort was a declaration of resolve. Built from cottonwood logs, it featured tall walls, blockhouses, and tightly packed quarters for over 30 men. It was more a shield from the wind than a place of comfort, but it worked. Temperatures dropped brutally low. Frostbite became a daily risk. Still, life inside Fort Mandan was far from idle. Lewis and Clark continued to obsessively document, logging temperatures, tribal languages, and even the number of kernels on local corn cobs. Crucially, this was where they met Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian trapper, and his young Shoshone wife, Sacagawea. While Charbonneau was officially hired as a translator, it was Sacagawea, pregnant at the time, who would prove indispensable in the months ahead. Her knowledge of Western terrain and ability to communicate with native groups would become more valuable than any weapon or map. Relations with the Mandan were mostly peaceful, though tensions occasionally flared. Cultural misunderstandings and limited resources led to friction. But the Corps knew, without native cooperation, their expedition might end in the snow. By spring 1805, the gear was repaired, journals were full, and Sacagawea's newborn son, Jean-Baptiste, was swaddled and ready. The Corps dismantled Fort Mandan and prepared to push forward, leaving behind the plains and stepping into true uncertainty. In April 1805, the expedition departed from Fort Mandan and re-entered the wild. With a leaner team and renewed urgency, they advanced toward the mountains. The pause of winter was over. Spring brought natural beauty and bloodthirsty pests. Mosquitoes swarmed constantly, robbing the men of sleep. Bison, deer, and bears became more common, but so did sunburn, swollen bites, and relentless humidity. Lewis documented it all, somewhere between scientific awe and mild torment. Disaster nearly struck when a pirogue capsized. Sacagawea remained calm, rescuing vital supplies including Clark's maps and journals. Her courage and steady hand earned her the admiration of the entire group. She had become more than a translator. She was a rock. By June, they reached the Great Falls of the Missouri, but rather than one waterfall, they found 5, spread across 18 miles. The view was stunning, the challenge punishing. For nearly a month, the men hauled boats and gear overland, dragging them across rough terrain using homemade carts and muscle. It was one of the hardest physical tests of the expedition. Then came a bitter-sweet sight. The snow-capped Rocky Mountains. Beautiful, yes, but terrifying. They had assumed these mountains would resemble the Appalachians. They didn't. These were towering giants, and the dream of a continuous water route to the Pacific died with that view. But hope returned with an extraordinary coincidence. When the Corps encountered the Shoshone, they discovered the chief was Sacagawea's brother. The reunion, part miracle, part legend, changed everything. The Shoshone agreed to supply horses, guides, and provisions, all vital for the next leg of the journey across the Bitterroot Mountains, where no boats could go. The Missouri had taken them as far as it could. Now the hardest part began. Crossing the Rockies was always going to be brutal. But even the expedition's worst expectations couldn't match the punishing reality of the Bitterroots. Leaving the river behind, the Corps advanced on horseback with their new Shoshone guides. It was early September 1805. The terrain ahead was unforgiving. Steep cliffs, thick forests, and trails barely wide enough for a man, let alone a pack horse. The conditions worsened. Snow, fog, and freezing winds turned the trails into nightmarish gauntlets. Wild game was scarce. The men ate candles, bone soup, and eventually horse meat. Their journals grew grim, listing what was edible and what was just desperation. Shoes fell apart. Frostbite set in. The infamous Lolo Pass saw them stumbling through deep snow, surviving on boiled roots and hides. Clark wrote plainly, they were out of food and relying entirely on horse flesh. It was the darkest stretch of the entire journey, but they endured. Emerging from the Bitterroots near present-day Idaho, the course stumbled into the lands of the Nez Perce. The tribe had every reason to reject them, but instead they offered kindness. The starving explorers were nursed back to health with fish and camas root. The Nez Perce even helped them carve new canoes to continue the journey downriver. Once again, survival had come through indigenous generosity, not just American grit. As they rested, Lewis and Clark stared westward. They were gaunt, frostbitten, and malnourished, but they were nearing the Columbia River basin. That meant one thing. The Pacific was within reach, but winter was not far behind. The final leg began with dugout canoes built from giant ponderosa pines, thanks to Nez Perce guidance. The goal, reach the Columbia River, the last major waterway to the Pacific. They had survived the mountains, but the river had its own fury in store. These coastal tribes expected fair exchange, and weren't shy about showing frustration when the Americans' trade offerings failed to impress. And then came the monotony. Trapped in a damp wooden fort, waiting endlessly for the weather to ease, the men passed their time boiling seawater for salt, repairing clothing, and whittling small trinkets. Morale waned. Sickness spread. Even Lewis, usually the calm and curious scientist, became short-tempered and withdrawn. By March 1806, they had reached their limit. Their journals were full, their samples preserved, and their bodies stiff and soaked from months of discomfort. They burned the last of their candles, packed whatever gear hadn't decayed, and faced east. They had reached the Pacific. Now came the harder task, surviving the long, exhausting journey back to civilization. There would be no awe of the unknown this time, only the memory of every grueling step ahead. In March 1806, the cause of discovery departed Fort Clatsop in soaked clothes, worn-out bodies, and with one clear mission: get home. They had done what no other Americans had, reached the Pacific over land, but the return journey would be just as dangerous, just as draining, and in many ways even more complex. The wilderness they had once entered with wonder now carried a more menacing tone. It was known, but no less brutal. They retraced their route along the Columbia River, once again facing treacherous currents, steep bluffs, and uneasy encounters with native tribes. Supplies dwindled. Bartering grew tougher. Tribes like the Chinook, more wary than before, seemed to sense that the Americans' arrival was the start of unsettling change. By late spring, the Corps made it back over the Bitterroot Mountains, helped by better weather and wiser planning, though it was still a punishing ordeal. Upon reaching the Nez Perce villages, they were welcomed warmly. The tribe had kept their horses safe and now helped the explorers prepare for the next leg of their return. Then Lewis and Clark took a bold step. They split the group into smaller parties to explore more territory. Lewis travelled north toward the Mercius River, aiming to map its link to the Missouri and expand American territorial knowledge. Clark followed the Yellowstone River, charting new paths through the plains and scouting for easier crossings. It was a risky move. With no way to communicate, each group was on its own. Lewis's expedition narrowly avoided disaster. In late July, they met a group of Blackfeet warriors who initially seemed welcoming, but became suspicious upon seeing the Americans' weapons and goods. A tense evening turned violent. A fight broke out, and 2 Blackfeet men were killed. These were the only deaths the expedition directly caused. Lewis's team fled into the night, shaken and wounded. Clark's group had a less dramatic return, but still faced danger, injuries, bison stampedes, and exhaustion. They reconnected with Sacagawea and her family, then journeyed down the Yellowstone River with relative success. By August 1706, both groups had reunited along the Missouri River. The core of discovery was whole again, though the excitement of discovery had faded. What remained was the hard, final push home. Battered, worn, but alive. By late August, the Missouri River once more carried the Corps downstream, not toward mystery, but back toward familiarity. They were thinner, their clothing was in tatters, and their journals soaked and heavy with notes, but they had survived. On September 23rd, 1806, the expedition finally reached St. Louis. They weren't met with parades, but with stunned amazement. Many had assumed them dead. In just over 2 years, Lewis and Clark had covered more than 8,000 miles. They crossed mountains, braved roaring rivers, met over 50 native tribes, and recorded hundreds of new species of plants and animals. Their maps were remarkably accurate. They had carved out a clear American presence in regions long claimed by indigenous peoples, Britain and Spain. The journey was declared a triumph. Newspapers hailed their achievements. President Jefferson, who had waited anxiously for news, was thrilled. Yet their paths after the expedition diverged dramatically. Meriwether Lewis was named governor of the Louisiana Territory, but struggled with depression, alcohol, and mounting debt. In 1709, just 3 years later, he died mysteriously at a remote inn along the Natchez Trace. Whether it was suicide or foul play remains unknown. His death cast a tragic shadow over the expedition he had led with such dedication. William Clark, in contrast, thrived. He became governor of the Missouri Territory, served as superintendent of Indian Affairs, and remained a key figure in America's western expansion. He named his first son Meriwether Lewis Clark, a tribute to his fallen friend. And what became of Sacagawea and York? Sacagawea returned west with her husband and son. Her later life is uncertain, but her place in American memory only grew. York, Clark's enslaved servant, had become a legend among native tribes, admired for his strength and presence. Yet Clark refused to free him for years, a painful contradiction in an otherwise celebrated story. The legacy of the Lewis and Clark expedition is both remarkable and complex. It opened the West to new exploration, trade and settlement, but it also marked the beginning of indigenous displacement, mapping lands without permission, laying the path for future upheaval. This wasn't just a tale of endurance or discovery. It was about ambition, resilience, cultural collisions, and the immense cost of manifest destiny. It reminds us that exploration is part of being human, but understanding what we've altered along the way, that's the deeper journey.